a very good mix of views from the floor and some very pointed questions. So I think we will now move on to the final speeches, and I'm going to ask Tim Stanley to begin those with...
I think I'll do it.
You'll do it?
Yeah, we'll have
You changed your mind?
No. We always do it.
I beg your pardon. Gisela is going to do the final one.
Yeah.
Yes, why don't you? It's 7 minutes, so please,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. Let me start by saying there's one area where the European Union is by far more Catholic than the Anglo-Saxon systems are, and that is the way of decision-making is done. It's very teleological. There's this assumption that there's such a thing as the right answer out there. And as long as you talk about it long enough, you will divine it. And you can never get rid of anything. Now that means it drives me round the bend, because any bad idea just won't go away. The Anglo-Saxon system is very much one which says, and seafaring nations, which kind of know you can't ride the waves, you can't control the waves, so the best thing you can do is learn to ride them. You become resilient. You build up systems of saying, we're going to come up with the most appropriate answer to a particular question at this given time, and every 5 years, we're either going to keep your lot in, or we kick you out and get another lot in, and you can have another go. So that's kind of the essence of the democratic structure. But apart from that, just sort of a few observations. One is, there's this notion out there that Europe is the thing which saves us from ourselves. And in a sense, that was the original idea. If you go back to the common market, it was meant to let's be frank about this, it was meant to stop the Germans making war on the French. And he created a structure which would not allow this to happen. The nation states were made to save themselves from the nastier side of nationalism. The Brits overcame that 300 years ago when George I in 1714, a Hanoverian, came to the throne, and the concept of Britishness developed. So this overcoming the darker side of nationalism. And one of the reasons why the darker side of nationalism is rising its head across Europe is because this idea of that you could create this supranational identity of being European isn't working when it's too big. That is your problem. Now, that takes me to what do I think does it mean to be a good neighbor? To be a good neighbor means that I don't try and impose on you things which are bad for you just because I have failed to realize that the world has changed and I want to go on dreaming my outdated dream. And that's what's happened to the European Union. Because arguably, this referendum today is the logical conclusion of a 20-year journey, which started with Maastricht, when we opted out of the single currency and we opted out of the common passport area. And we could go on pretending that you could live in kind of sort of, living a little bit in sin, you lot go this way, we'd sort of just do it a bit slower, when the others introduced the single currency. So if I want to help those Spanish youngsters, if I want to help those Greek youngsters, they need to integrate more deeply. The Germans have to stop creating a single currency based on them only exporting. They will be better off, we will be better off. That's why I think this challenge at the moment is such an important one. Let's then say about British leadership, you're absolutely right. Britain has, over the last centuries, on a number of occasions, because it's this resilient democracy, come to the rescue when things have gone wrong. But we're now 1 out of 28. 3.2% of our officials in the Commission are British. The Prime Minister has just done the most amazing or the most intensive process of renegotiation. He came back with nothing. Let's just be real. He came back with nothing. Removal of words which mean nothing anyway, a temporary opt-out of, you have to be here for 6 months and then get a job, but there's no method of actually enforcing this. And by the way, anybody here who talked about people having to leave, 24th of June, anybody who's here will stay here, just like any Brit living anywhere else will still be there. Nobody's removing anybody anywhere. But what we can do on the 24th, and that's really important, there are 2 things. One is what you have seen is the most extraordinary movement on the ground in favor of leaving. When I first got involved, there was still this notion out there that if you were in favor of leaving, you were something of a bit of a bad person. You were inward-looking, you were insular, you were a bit of a closet racist, you weren't very bright, and you were probably the wrong end of 60. That was kind of the notion which was going on out there. But there's this line in I vow to thee my country, which I think is wonderful. You know that line? And soul by soul and silently her shining bounds increase? That's what's been happening. People out there have started to look whether it is the right thing to do, both for us and for the rest of Europe. And it has increased. And would be the easiest thing in the world not to face up to this difficult choice and say, oh, come on, let's give this another try. It'd be so much easier. But I think in the long term, democratic accountability, democratic resilience has served as well. Openness to the whole of the world, not thinking that, if you build fences around something bigger than your own country, just because you call it Europe, that those fences are good. It's global decision-making. It includes the Commonwealth. It includes Africa, in a sense. We need to be more outward-looking. We need to be reaching out, and the European Union has simply failed to adopt to that. And therefore, if you want to be a good neighbor to the rest of Europe, you allow those European countries who got a single currency to create that country called Europe with accountability, and you allow us to go and reaching out to the rest of the world, and both sides will be stronger. And surely that must be a good thing to do.
Thank you. There are a few things that I think probably unite both sides and several of the speakers, whether from the floor or from the panel. Like Gisela, I actually grew up in a community where I was in a majority. So you will just have listened to me and looked at my name and thought, an English Catholic. But in fact, most of my forebears weren't English. Most of them were Irish. The odd one was Cornish and the odd one was German. But I grew up in Crosby, a suburb of Liverpool, where we were 50-50, essentially, Catholic, Anglican. And I grew up in a community where you went to a Catholic church, a Catholic school, a Catholic brownie pack. Your family were all Catholics, and if anybody you met wasn't a Catholic, that was a little bit strange. So for me, a bit like Gisela, I grew up as a cradle Catholic, and that was part of my identity, far more than being British or English. And I don't particularly identify with being English, but I do identify with being British and Catholic. I haven't had to spend as long with Giscard as Gisela had. I've only had a dinner with him once. So he didn't manage to put me off the European Union or the constitutional process. But having come from a port, so Liverpool also as originally a dock area, I suppose I've also got the pragmatism that characterises the United Kingdom. So I would say my view of Britain in Europe isn't one that is entirely idealistic. I think there is a degree of pragmatism as to why I think that the United Kingdom should remain in the European Union and why, as Catholics, we should be espousing that. Because I think it is actually better for European states that we work together. Now, the idea that we can simply walk away is something we can clearly do. And I am absolutely clear that if the vote on the 23rd of June is that the United Kingdom wants to leave the European Union, then the Prime Minister, or whoever succeeds him as Prime Minister, has a duty to negotiate for us to leave the European Union. I'm not in any way advocating a conspiracy that says somehow in Parliament we can overturn the will of the people, because if we're going to have a referendum, we have to abide by it. But is it in the interests of the British people or Catholics to be walking away? Well, in terms of secularism and values, many of the issues that have come up in the European Union, so the Buttiglione issue, I think if he'd been offered the job, the role of Commissioner for External Relations or Financial Affairs, it probably wouldn't have mattered. His Catholicism and his views wouldn't have mattered at all, for good or ill. It was that he was being asked to be the Commissioner for Equalities. And I think asking somebody with very clear Catholic values to be responsible for a policy area where clearly the direction of travel in the European Union and in the United Kingdom is rather different, which would have put far more emphasis on gay rights and so on, I think would have been a bad fit. That shouldn't have meant they withdrew him as a commissioner. They should have simply swapped the portfolios. And whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it is a reflection of life in the 21st century. One of it happens to be a Leave peer, but it doesn't really matter. In the House of Lords recently, we were debating genocide. One of the peers stood up and said, we're a Christian country. We should open up to Syrian Christian victims of, or obviously not victims of genocide, but those in fear of genocide. And the fact that he said we're a Christian country, I heard a sharp intake of breath. Now, that happens to be because I'm on the Liberal Democrat benches, where not many of us are Catholics, but nevertheless, I think we have problems in our own country about accepting the fact that we are still a Christian country. We have an established church. How can we not be a Christian country in some ways? But I think we all have to stand up to be counted, and that is us as Catholics and as Christians of other denominations. But the fact we're in the European Union doesn't stop that. The fact we didn't get Christianity into the Constitution, frankly, if you tried getting that through the Houses of Parliament, I'm not sure we'd have achieved that. But in terms of the economy and whether we integrate more or not, and whether we say we should walk away and allow the Eurozone to integrate more, one of the huge benefits of free movement of people is precisely that the young unemployed from Spain and Italy and elsewhere can come to this country where there are jobs. So I think we need to be really clear. It's an advantage that 30 years ago, when there was high unemployment in the UK, people went from here to Germany. Think about Boys from the Black Stuff. That was about British people not having jobs and taking up jobs elsewhere in a more buoyant economy. Now the reverse is the case. If we leave the European Union, nobody is going to say, oh, well, we'll have a system where we allow in lots of young, unemployed Spanish people or Greek people. So it's all very well for those who want to leave suddenly to say, oh, it's terrible for these people. The EU is doing them such a disservice. Therefore, we want to leave and take away their opportunities for jobs. So I think we need to be very careful about what we're saying if we talk about leaving. And in terms of who it benefits to remain, it is absolutely the case that there are some sections of society for whom free movement appears to be much more beneficial. The Erasmus schemes, the cheap Polish plumber, clearly plays well in middle-class communities. I'm not denying that. And if you are from a fishing community or some parts of the farming community, you might say the EU's been bad for us. What we need to understand, though, as well, is that if we leave the European Union, the people who will be most badly affected will be those already the poorest in society. The economic hit won't be to the rich, whether the elites on Remain or leave. They're going to be to some of the poorest communities, often in the north of England. And what we need to do is make sure that we don't jeopardise their futures. The current British economy is doing well. We're in a safe, stable place. If we remain in the European Union, we can work with our neighbours to improve that. We can work with the Commonwealth. We could do far more for our Commonwealth links, but there is nothing about being in the European Union that forces us to be inward-looking. Germany trades more with India than we do. Belgium exports more to India than we do. This isn't right. The United Kingdom should stop looking to the EU and blaming the EU for things it doesn't like, and think about being more ambitious, more outward-looking, more willing to work with our Commonwealth partners, with our European partners, and accepting we have a global role to play, but we can do that far more effectively as members of the European Union, playing a key part, leading by example, bringing our pragmatism to bear, playing a key role, and not just walking away.
Very much indeed. And just a reminder, as you think about your final vote of the motion, this House believes Catholic values are best served by remaining in the European Union.